And we're live. So, how are you doing?
Doing well. Great to join you.
Great to have you. I'm super excited about this. We're going to talk about Betrayal of the American Right. I read it, listened to it, and I listened to it again yesterday. I really enjoyed it. The political history is fun and hard to find good political history.
Yes,
Yeah.
and in particular, someone of Rothbard's his interest in so many other topics. I mean, this is kind of just a side passing hobby for his, and so being able to get, particularly him dealing with so many different aspects of political thought. There's so much good stuff they did here.
Oh yeah. Uh, Personally, I enjoyed reading about his going from publishing to different networks, like from Feed to all those different organizations. It's really fun to kind of see like the people who write articles and stuff going from place to place. When they get kicked out of somewhere, that place shuts down. It's really interesting.
Well, it's something that I don't think it's paid nearly enough attention to, which is the importance of institutions within a political movement, within an ideological movement, the different politics behind the scenes that is having a lot of different impact on things. I mean, if you had the Volcker Fund, for example, continue much longer, later on, I mean, you would have had a very different Austro-libertarian sphere just from that. So that's something I think it's something that it plays such a big role, particularly in Austrian history. Generally, you can see with some of Mises's work as well. The support staff that he had when he came here from Europe. It's a combination of the importance of these things as institutions themselves, but also the personalities behind the scenes, which you can't separate one without the other.
Oh yeah, that's like I tweeted out the other day that Jason Stapleton, so like Rose power and influencing, without the rich people backing Mises, he wouldn't have a job in New York. Without the rich people, the fund for Rothbard, a lot of his works probably would have been self-published to find some other avenue. Like the people behind the scenes he funded are very important, and we seem to ignore a lot of them.
Oh, no, absolutely.
So, when did you first read this book? Like when it first came out, or?
No. I read it. I think it was about 2016 or so, and then I listened to the audiobook. I think we put the audiobook out on some new podcast platforms. I think it was 2017 or so, and that kind of refreshed me. And then it's interesting going through some of the 90s Rothbard stuff. You see that there's some excerpts, there's some parts of the book here that were published as triple R articles as well, some of the autobiographical stuff. So you kind of see those little touches as well. But yeah, it's a fascinating book. I'm so glad that it was published after Rothbard's death. It was a project with Tom Woods played a major role in, and it fleshes out, I think, again, Rothbard's journey itself, which I think it's important, particularly with a scholar like Rothbard. It is very, very difficult to separate his political work and his output from where he is in that point in time. And I think this is kind of a great little perspective at so much of the other output from Rothbard himself.
Yeah. So he seemed to go from, my understanding, he was with the conservatives, kind of the conservative stuff. Left those went to the left in the 60s, then saw the LP and went back to the right. Is that the order? I mean, I have that backwards.
Yeah. So his early days, he's one of the most conservative people in his neighborhood. He's supporter of Strom Thurmond in his presidential run. And then really one of those moments that is very big in this story, and it's interesting because you see some parallels in other aspects of the American right, is for Rothbard, the separation point was it was Eisenhower's nomination in 1952 Republican Party convention. And as a victory over the Robert Taft old right crowd. And again, I think it's interesting when you parallel some different stuff, because again, like this is kind of right before the conservative movement, capital C, really gets off the ground. It's in the direct aftermath of that where you have the National View really taking its position as the intellectual bulwark of the conservative movement. You have the rise of Buckley, all this sort of stuff. You also have, for example, if you're looking for one of the parallel stories here, you have like the John Birch Society. You have Robert Welch at this time, who's kind of growing in interest here. One of the moments that the John Birch Society, the reasons that they were kind of pushed out of the right was their skepticism to Eisenhower, calling him a commie, basically. So that specific moment, I think, is really, really interesting, because like that, if you're looking for where that turn starts, and it's funny because if from our perspective now, as products of the 21st century, more or less, we look backwards and we remember Eisenhower as being the whistleblower about the military-industrial complex, right? Eisenhower now looks like this radical right figure, and fairly so given how things have changed. But again, it's just that itself, I think, makes it interesting. That was that moment involving shenanigans with the convention and party machines and that sort of stuff. Is always interesting. But yes, that's where Rothbard pivots from the right, joins the rising anti-war movement of the 60s, leaves there like after 5 years, in spite of having a lot of success, and then you have the libertarian movement before getting the 90s.
One thing I really liked is that you look at the old right, and then that opening chapter about the more often than not, God bless the establishment, now it's God damn the establishment. It seems the right now is kind of back to that attitude. Like the right's been kind of gone full circle, the old right again, with a very anti-establishment, they're not trusting of it, and it's interesting to kind of see the right go from left wing to more right wing, kind of back and forth. It's fun to examine.
Yeah, and you know, as mentioning on the parallels there, you know, because the old right at the time, and this is kind of fleshed out in some of Rothbard's other work, the old right was not an ideology, it was not a movement, it was a reaction. It was a reaction to, you know, in large part, you know, the various escalations of state power from the progressive era, right? So you had a bunch of different sort of groups that were interested, you know, and again, this plays out in his article on the strategy for the right, but, you know, a lot of these institutions and a lot of the intellectual firepower, you know, were libertarians. And so even though as a number-wise, the libertarians were a very, very small percentage of the larger sort of old right reaction, anti-FDR sort of movement, they had outsized influence here. And it's because, you know, you had Fee and Mises and you know, you had Henry Hazlitt, the New York Times, a lot of the idea producers, the original content producers of this period of history were libertarian, therefore you had outsized influence, but it was a reaction to the progressive victories of that time. You have the same sort of situation now where you have the burning down of these conservative institutions, rather than, so you know, you don't have necessarily an ideology of the current Republican Party. I mean, let's try to use this just the broadest term possible, kind of the popular conservative movement. And so you have all of, you know, the 2000s have kind of gone out with there, and you have kind of this more paleo, you have a variety, and there's a lot of intellectual diversity amongst these various figures that are popping through, some for better, some for worse. And so I do think there's a lot of these parallels there, as long as with this kind of this general thought about, you know, what should America's role within foreign policy be, you know, kind of the dial down of, at least politically, the war on terror aspect. You know, somewhere here, you kind of had, you know, you just didn't have the empire quite fully formed yet, so that, you know, you had that vacuum on that side. But yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels there, and I think there's lessons that can be learned from them, as well as just, you know, appreciating its little period in history.
Let's talk about the modern conservative movement for a moment. There's a lot of conservatives that are all over the place. Like, you listen to Michael Knowles and Ben Shapiro one day, and it's anti-successor nonsense. You listen to Matt Walsh the next, and it's all about leaving a national divorce. Who are some good conservatives we could actually listen to?
I think today that the crowd, I mean, I think the Claremont crowd is for the most part good. Is interesting. Let me put it that way. The problem is that, you know, when you start identifying allies, you know, when they're wrong, they're usually really wrong, just because that's kind of you know, the bias of small differences. Yeah, I think one of the great advantages that we have now is that, you know, the modern day William Buckley is Tucker Carlson, which is a major upgrade in terms of being that figure on TV. You know, very you know, he American, populist politics always, you know, is anti-elite, but typically it has sort of an elitish sort of spokesperson, right? Tucker Carlson kind of fits that.
Yeah.
You know, so that all that sort of stuff is very interesting. And of course now then you have this additional interesting aspect of it, which is, you know, the kind of the modern your American right, how you want to define it, is very online as well. So you have that influence of, you know, not only the resurrection, you know, resurrected interest might be downplaying the significance prior, you know, but you have the Curtis Yarvins and the Molebugs, you know, these, you know, kind of the pure unfiltered sort of theory and weird history, you know, sort of stuff as well. I think that definitely is flavoring. You know, the amount, you know, when you have Molebug on a Fox News app is pretty revolutionary. Yeah. And I think that's, you know, so what you have right now is a very intellectually interesting environment. And of course this goes hand in hand with why you're going to see, I think, you know, why we've had this period of increased censorship online because they're trying to restrict, I think, a lot of the free discourse in this set of things. But one of the biggest things though is making sure that we're not only reading people that we like on most of the issues. And so I think that it's important to see where you have, again, going back to the importance of institutions, it's important to read Claremont, for example, because here you have an institution with money behind it that is going in very interesting directions. And also just identifying where some of these institutions are changing. For example, Heritage could have rebuilt itself, and it still has some interesting scholars there. I'm not trying to pan it entirely. Peter St. Allen, who's a Mises Institute guy, he's over there, very good. Read everything he says. But it could have really radically transformed itself, and it really didn't. Maybe the next president will. And so it's also interesting to see which institutions don't change with the times, and which ones do. Because again, I think we always have this issue where we want to hold out grudge. We want to fault these institutions, often made up of churning people, right? And hold them for the sins of the past. I think that can be counterproductive at times. We need to appreciate when you do have these changes as they are happening. And I think there are some, again, like Tucker Carlson, for example, anyone trying to use 2004 Tucker Carlson against him, I think is making a big mistake.
Yeah. That's a good point. Tucker Carlson is the new Buckley, which is a major improvement because Buckley sucked so much. I mean, I deal a lot with the tradcons on Twitter, and they're all just Buckleyites. And it's like, it's so left wing.
Well, the thing is that there is an idea of Buckley that that is easy to like, right? Here you have kind of that class traitor sort of element, man of Yale, insulting the intelligence of Ivy League, academics. You got the great thing. I'd rather be governed by random people in the phone book than the Harvard faculty. He was, and what he was recognized at the time is here is a conservative delivering a hardcore message in a popular medium, television. I mean, Buckley literally was the original right-wing cable news pundit with the infamous 1968 convention with him and Gore Vidal providing left and right perspectives there. So, so it is interesting that you had a genuine intellectual, out there in the much broader sphere, and he understood the culture war dynamic of politics. And this is something he would talk about a great deal, is that politics downstream of culture. Politics, there is that sort of Andrew Breitbart sort of element to the best of Buckley. The problem is then you also have real Buckley, right? And real Buckley is you have this deliberate move on the foreign policy side of things is one of his biggest triumphs. Though it is worth pointing out that Buckley later on in his life, Iraq War is bad. His brother even has talked about how Gore Vidal was right about the American empire. Again, it's interesting to note, doesn't forgive what had happened there. But more importantly, though, is beyond simply Buckley himself as an individual figure, that conservative movement that he did build, one, it has the consequence of elevating a lot of the Trotskyites and former communists, and which breeds all sorts of interesting stuff. James Burnham being one of that, which again is interesting given his modern relevance. On the other side of it, though, on top of propping up the Trotskyites and all that sort of aspect of it, the flip side of it is it's also used as a tool of purging, which was used against Murray Rothbard, was used against the John Birch Society, was used against Pat Buchanan, was used against, and we saw against this similar sort of platform, used on the right and fail with Trump, but has used on the right in the past, and so that's the real consequence there, and it'd be interesting now that. And in many ways, I think that aspect of Buckley, the movement he's built, is what's aged a lot poorer than that idea of Buckley the man. And so I'm not surprised at all that there are some Zoomers and things like that identifying kind of an interesting figure and trying to do a revisionist take of some sorts there. But again, they identified a different person than Buckley because, again, Bill Buckley and the conservative movement, the consequences thereof have been a disaster for mankind.
Yeah. Absolutely. It seemed like Rothbard really went to the right, the old right, because of the isolationists. They were isolationists. There seems to be a resurgence of isolationists now. The more, and it's interesting. It really is interesting to kind of. Reason I love the book and I've listened to it twice is the right, and he describes in the old right is very much akin to the modern right, and as someone who's also a paleo, trying to figure out the history and then go to him and say, "Hey, we were out before. Here's where we worked together." Uh, what do you think was the what was the main reason you think the isolationist right died off and kind of became more neocons? Like, what was the argument? What really?
Well, that was definitely the Buckley interest, and it was pitted. Obviously, you had this great clash of civilizations between the freedom of America and the communism of the Soviet Union, and of course, in order to fight the communism abroad, the Buckleyites embraced communism here at home. Though again, it's worth noting, just I think the nuance here makes it all the more fascinating is that break on. If you look at some of the great Austrian thinkers whose works on and if in general their views on political views are outstanding, but Henry Hazlitt was close to Bill Buckley throughout his life and continued to write for the National Review. Mises would still appear at times in the National Review. He was a little more hawkish than Rothbard on that, which also shows where one of the biggest disagreements between Rothbard and Mises came from Rothbard's embrace of the New Left in the late '60s. So yeah, so that again, that's that big push there, and that's, I think, if you look in the modern right, you do see the interesting conflicts now. For one, because again, if we're in kind of a post-war on terror, Middle Eastern politics, sort of, again, overly simplified, but whatever. Now you see some beating the we're past we shouldn't be fighting Al Qaeda, but we've got to fight China. Right, so you see this once again, this attempt to kind of pivot to the China threat, and I think it's very interesting when you see the different dynamics on the right pushing back against that. For example, again, I think Tucker Carlson's been pretty good on this. Revolver News with Darren Beattie has been very, very big anti-China hawk, and I think increasingly it's going to be less, do we want to drone bomb kids in the Middle East, and more, should we go to war with China? And I understand, and that's going to be, I think, a lot more of a difficult task. I think it's much easier opposing wars in the desert than it is against, again, the perception of this great civilizational threat in China. And so much of what we are told about China as a whole, that is where I think it's going to be very difficult, because it's always easy to look back again years after and say, oh, well, it's obvious that this military engagement was wrong. But of course, at the time, everyone thought it was right. I think China, that China issue might be, is, I think, quickly becoming that issue now. And so yeah, to the importance of non-interventionist foreign policy to the best strands of American right political thought, that is the chapter that I think is most important going forward right now.
Let's talk about FEE. Foundation, Foundation for Economic Education. Yeah. So they seem to be very centralized, very right wing, a lot of them were anarchists, from my understanding. And then what was the main guy's name?
Leonard Reed.
Leonard Reed. He didn't seem. Was he the? I'm terrible with names, but there was a guy at FEE who did not like that they were called Tory anarchists. It was scared of investments. Yeah. Like, what exactly is a Tory anarchist? I keep hearing that term. I don't know exactly what it refers to.
Yeah, that was what H.L. Mencken called himself as, kind of this, and again, that goes back to some of that kind of classic American right wing sort of stuff. But yeah, there was always this dynamic. Reed did not like the A word. Of course, neither Mises and others, they were proud minarchists in that degree. So there was always a little bit of a tension there. But I think Leonard Reed, in my opinion, if you want to talk about the libertarian movement, the two indispensable men are Leonard Reed and Rockwell, precisely. Not that the great scholarship of Rothbard and Mises, obviously not to do anything to diminish that, but again, as we talked about earlier, the importance of institutions in order to giving platforms for those ideas. Ideas without institutions are just renting out the void. Yeah. And what Leonard Reed was able to build, coming from a very big background, he was the head of the LA Chamber of Commerce. Prior to, he built a very powerful network, and so much of Mises's work, the impact it had was directly the result of FEE creating these platforms for mass readership. And I think it's also important for when you think about just kind of general populist strategies in general, it doesn't require watering down or dumbing down your message. Fee was a populist institution. The Louis von Mises Institute has always been a populist institution. The entire, the purpose is to spread out these ideas as broadly as possible. And what Reed was able to build there at Fee was something that we all have owe a great deal to. And again, it should also be pointed out as you alluded to. One of the strengths of this American libertarian movement from a fundraising standpoint was that they were kind of culturally conservative people that played well, with a more conservative demographic that had the funds possible to support these institutions. And again, that's something that's a lesson that I think a lot of libertarians have lost over time, but it's a whole other thing.
No, I've been really talking to a lot of the post-lib paleo people. I had Pete on my show. I've been talking to a lot of them, and I got to say the '90s Rothbard and the paleo stuff. I'm reading your Substack. It's very interesting. Like '90s Rothbard was a very interesting character.
Absolutely. Well, 90 politics in general was, and what's interesting though is again, this is what I love about this book. This is what the more you read Rothbard as a political commentator or a political analyst, generally, the more you can just appreciate the different layers here, because it was Rothbard's ability to take kind of these cornerstone ideas, right? Kind of the pure essence of his political knowledge. How should a society govern, and then his ability to package it, in so many different ways, adapting to the times, to the audiences, and things like that. Because if you think about 90s politics, it's not like, and you read Rothbard's style. I mean, Rothbard's always kind of is always an entertaining writer, particularly relative to other economists, historians, etc. But it just takes on a whole different punch with the newsletters in the 90s, and it's because this was the rise of Rush Limbaugh. This is the rise of kind of that entertainment aspect of politics, and here you have Rothbard going blow to blow. Again, just laugh out loud funny. You read some of his analysis here. It was his ability, again, of being so talented and keeping up with those times, and also him, I think, refining, again, taking those libertarian ideas but applying them to a non-libertarian culture and society. And I think probably for a good thing. I don't think a libertarian culture is necessarily a good thing for maintaining society. And depending on some of your definition of libertarianism. And what I also think is interesting is that, so if you look at the essence of it, this is kind of Rothbard is most Misesian, because he this is where he really starts writing about the importance of kind of the nationality sort of aspect of political governance. The recognition that so long as you have an interventionist state, you have to start using some of the tools of the interventionist state to defend your own people, because if not, you start to get in the situation of anarcho tyranny, which got popularized by Sam Francis, who was running in these sort of circles with Rothbard. And I think that's that aspect of it, which again I think Mises always got. He just he spoke about it from a noble sort of perspective, which can kind of get lost on people. But I think that 90s Rothbard is the most Misesian Rothbard, and I think that those lessons of Mises and Rothbard both translate here so well. And I think one of the things I think is important is engaging with this interesting neo-reactionary new right, again, whatever you want to call this movement happening right now, with these ideas. Because when you recognize, when you can package the fact that, okay, well, Mises and Rothbard understood a lot of your same complaints and shared a lot of your same concerns, and you package it with the economics that they have, Austrian economics being being value free, like it's not a free market dogma in the way that some of their criticisms are, like some of the Friedman sort of approach to things, and some of the and that, then again, not that it obviously free markets are very, very important to Austrian understanding of the way the world works, but neither here nor there. Being able to mix those two with this current environment, given all those parallels that we've talked about, I think is so important, and that's what we're trying to do.
Maybe you have an answer for this one, because I want to read more about Rothbard when they came to the LP and they came to the Cato Institute. Are there any good books kind of about the history of that, or like kind of go over that?
There's one of the first books I read early on. And it's funny because it's hated by a lot of people in my circles. For reasons I understand. Is Brian Doherty's Radicals for Capitalism. It is kind of a kind of a general history of the American libertarian movement. And I think that if you read the book, you'll see a certain perspective is over represented, kind of the George Mason sort of, which I don't fault Brian Doherty. I mean, I'm not faulting him for the product. But if you read it with that sort of understanding going in there, I think you will just kind of appreciate why there's a little bit of friction at times with I know Joe Salerno, for example, is a very negative review of the book, and I'm endorsing the book while also supporting his review to reconcile those two things. But he goes into a lot of the details there on some of that stuff from the Cato perspective. Also, David Gordon has some great stuff kind of from the Rothbard part of view on some of the great Koch drama. I think it's something with the Kochtopus. I know it's on LRC, but that's also, I think, very, if you want to get that perspective, is there. There is a biography by Justin Raimondo on Murray Rothbard that also touches it from that perspective as well. David Gordon's articles would be a little easier than reading that book, but those are where I would go if you're interested in some of that fun intermovement drama.
I very much am. It was very fun. What little bit of it I got out of the book I was reading, I want to read more of it. Rothbard going from place to place is very, very fun to read.
Well, it's funny because Rothbard's just such an over-the-top character, and I think Rothbard's brilliant, but I could understand how you could have certain people. One of the problems that Rothbard had, for example, is that he would always produce way too much content, right? He'd be hired to, here's a simple project and it'd turn into a 4-point treatise, right? Mm-hmm. And so I can understand how that why some people benefactors would be frustrated by that. I think that's natural. At the same time, though, it's interesting on the more substantive ones with particularly just that Koch dynamic. It's interesting. I remember back in the day, 10 years or so ago, because time flies, kind of the peak of the Ron Paul golden era. And, one of the common things that with all these new Ron Paul people would be sitting around, it's like, man, why can't we just all get along? The Mises, Koch stuff, all this drama is just so silly. It's all back in the day, a bunch of people that aren't even relevant anymore. Can't we just get over that and just talk about the ideas? And now, sitting here in 2021, it's interesting. I think all of those divides have just kind of replayed themselves out, particularly in the last 16 months with the 18 months with, and it's okay, no, these divides probably these were meaningful. It wasn't just pettiness for the sake of petty. It's there are some notes there. Even if some of the specific positions, for example, one of the issues that Rothbard attacked the Kochs for, in the 80s, their split, was the Kochs being to the right on being anti-open borders and Rothbard being an open borders guy, where now you would think of the Rothbardians being the more closed borders is the wrong term, but kind of Hoppian on immigration, and now you have the Koch brothers being let them in, and so it's just so in spite of the fact that some of the specific issues have kind of changed, there's been some nuance formed. The rationale behind it, I still think is justified, and it's just some of those old things that you can only learn from appreciating the true history of the personalities involved in some of this stuff.
I agree. Let's talk a little bit about the Paleo Strategy. So you're up in was it Bay County?
Yes, Bay County, Florida.
Nice. I'm in Polk County.
Okay.
Down in Central. I got a couple of friends about we're big fans of what you're doing in Bay County. We want to try to do the same thing in Polk County. What exactly did you do? What was your order? What steps did you take to do what you did?
So I've been active in Bay County politics off and on since high school. And I ran for office in 2014, which I gave in fourth place out of 4 people, but people recognized that I had some substance to me, and so I kept using Facebook posts. And so, being, an informed individual first and foremost, being able to provide substantial commentary that you're not going to get from average people in the community, that helped give me credibility, when I came back and started getting active in the Bay County Republican Party once again after Trump. Because people recognized I had some substance to me. then I was able to take over a group, just because often, these are all kind of volunteer-driven sort of things. Taking on the effort of organizing some of these clubs and doing some of that work really can go a long way. And so I've been running social media for the Bay GOP, various degrees since 2018, and I'm president of a conversation group where we bring in speakers, have talks and things like that. And so the important thing about that is it's given me a platform to be a mouthpiece for the local Republican Party. And I think it's particularly important in an area like Bay County and like Polk, where that you're dealing in a deep red area of the people. So you have a Republican brand that has a positive view by the majority of your average person. When they think about political things, they usually think about it team red versus team blue.
Yeah.
And then using that to be the most outspoken, advocate of the most romanticized idea of Trump, DeSantis, right? Because one of the things I think is important is that, and again, I think we hit on it a little bit, is that ultimately politics is about people. It's not about ideas. Now, ideas motivates the people, but you can't separate the man from the power or from the idea. And this is something that I think we often get so wrong. And it's comes from a variety of ways. From one is that, I think we also kind of misinterpret some things, but we always there's that old, I think it's credited to Eleanor Roosevelt. I have no idea if it's real or not. But good minds talk about, or average minds talk about people, good minds talk about events, great minds talk about ideas. And people hear that and they want to think that, oh, well, I'm a great scholar, I'm an intellectual, I'm beyond these tribalisms, and I'm going to impress you by how much smarter I am than you. I think every libertarian has that feel, and it's good to work that out. It's good to get used to having that sort of confidence. But it becomes detrimental to the way if it goes on for too long. So what you need is people, and what ultimately mobilizes individuals, the masses to follow, is it's the icons of Washington, of Jefferson, of Jackson. FDR, was able to take on that mantle. Lincoln has became that legacy, right? And one of the things that Rothbard during the Paleo Strategy was willing to do was to embrace individual imperfect figures like Pat Buchanan, right? And that's what I think you have to do now. And so you have to wrap yourself in. If your number one enemy is the American regime, then Donald Trump is the figure of the resistance. And you can complain about that all you want, and a lot of the complaints will be very, very valid, right? Oh, Trump could have done this, whatever. Doesn't matter. The opposition to Biden is Trump. Your average American, if they want to stick a middle finger to Trump or to Biden, they either say F you Biden, or they say Trump won, right? Like that. And so again, so you can either nitpick Trump, or you can be a part of that movement, going back to that again. And again, as the intellectual, when you can provide ideas and analysis and areas of expertise that are not common amongst this growing intellectual class. Again, I think the economic side for us has always been our strength. We can have an outsized influence in spite of being a smaller part of this larger backlash movement, but you have to respect, rather than talk down to, the individual figures that motivate. And that's something that has motivated me. And has really changed in a lot of ways. Again, the Trump era has totally changed my period of politics, my view of politics, and it's something that, again, if your views have been unchallenged since 2012 or whenever, the Ron Paul days were, if you sound exactly like you were back then, it is not a sign of some profound, noble ideological consistency. It is either a disinterest in the political process, which requires this sort of persuasion, which is perfectly fine, or it is being bad at politics if you're still if you're still trying to pretend to be active in the political sphere, right? And so I think what's exciting is that the paleo-libertarian literature gives us that sort of history and that sort of guidance from one of the great men of the movement in engaging the current environment as it exists. And thankfully, it's caught the creativity and attention of a lot of good people, a lot of good libertarians that are able to produce all sorts of output. And it's been fun to see the reactions from people like yourself and throughout others that have reached out to me, because I think that this is the best way to make sure that our ideas grow. You know, I would say maintain relevance, but they haven't been relevant, right? To grow within what is a very exciting challenge to the regime that's existed for far too long.
Mm-hmm. It's been true that a lot of libertarians really do like to elevate themselves, or like I'm not left, I'm not right, they like to elevate themselves above it all and talk down to people when they, and then they wonder why no one listens to them. Well, you're a smug bitch talking down to everybody.
Right.
It's like why do people listen to you?
Most not all, and like if you are a genuinely career successful libertarian and you sort of have that approach, and fine, you've earned it. Like get out. And also at that point, your ego and your self-esteem probably isn't coming down to politics. Again, there's nothing wrong with being off-putting if you're not interested in politics, right? There's a role for that. But if you're claimed to be interested in politics and you have this perspective, or if there's no other accomplishment in your life that you take pride in more than your libertarianism, then that's where it feeds a natural but toxic sort of aspect of it. And it's, again, falling into these traps is perfectly fine. Like, it doesn't make you a bad person, it makes you human, right? And we're all human. Some of us try to pretend we're better than human, but we're all human. Yeah. And you can always be better. And so, there's nothing wrong with recognizing, okay, like, yeah, this was not ideal behavior. I'm going to be better going forward. And that's, again, I think that there's a lot of libertarians searching for that. And if they don't follow the paleo libertarian approach, and that's fine. But just trying to ask those questions and doing that sort of self-reflection, that itself is an important step, no matter how you end up following thereon after.
Absolutely. You have two of my favorite social media interactions I've ever seen.
Oh.
One of them was on Facebook.
Uh-huh.
And Artsy Flower was complaining about the Mises caucus being paleos or something, and you hopped in there like, I'm trying, Artsy, I'm trying. Which is one of my favorites. And the other one was you wanted to start a libertarian fantasy football league.
Yes.
Or some insane Hazel was like, why don't we go to other ones and try to spread liberty? And you're like, that's how you make people hate us.
Yes.
Both are great takes.
It's for one, like, the paleo stuff is always so funny because it's just used as a generic slur from some people, and it's like, now, like, if the LP Mises caucus was actually going down the strategy, I wouldn't be debating Dave Smith. He'd be a Republican by now. But and the other thing is, just don't politicize every other aspect of,
Yeah, that's what the left did, and we hate them for it.
Yeah, that's how you. The last thing you want is, not that you'd ever, he would ever generate the sort of spirit or notoriety needed, but as you get like F. Shane Hazel tweets at like a Georgia Bulldog game because you're trying to politicize stuff. Like, you don't want that. That's not good for the brand.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, we're running out of time. This has been a lot of fun. So if you could recommend 3 books to people, what 3 books would you recommend?
That's a very good question. One, I'm going to go for fun here. I think either one of Gore Vidal's history books. I would go with either Burr or 1876. But I think that they're very fun in part because they'll open you up to a writer very well outside our group. Gore Vidal was the embodiment of the left. And it's a novel, which is a little bit different than some of the other, but it's Gore Vidal was a very well-researched historian. You get a lot of great historical perspective. It's got a little bit of revisionist stuff in the Founding Fathers. I think it's a great book. If you get the 1876 one, and particularly go down one of my favorite rabbit holes in history, which is the election of 1876 and Uncle Sam.
I was gonna ask you about that at the end.
Yeah. We'll go down that. So I think one of those two I'd highly recommend. Another would be. I'm trying to think of a book that really just. One right now that I'd really recommend, because it's one of those books that if you read this one book, which is 200-something pages, you will know more about the most important story than 99% of the people you'll ever be in rooms with. It's China's Great Wall of Debt. It was published in, I think it was 2019 or so by was it Denny McMahon, I think is his name. That's a fun book because it really goes in. Anyways, one of the things I like about it is that there's McMahon has no economic theoretical perspective that I can take. Like, it's really just him kind of describing what he saw in China the last 10 years. And I think if you have a little bit of an Austrian perspective there, it's very useful. I'm going to cop out with the last one and give two different books, kind of depending on your familiarity with the Austrian school. One is, if you have no familiarity with Austrian economics and looking for like a fun little introduction, I would go with Boombustology by an Indian investor guy that is taught at Harvard and Yale. That's a fun. It's not a normal Mises Institute book, and I'm not going to say everything in there is perfect, but it's fun because it's a guy. His little hook is he's got like 5 different lenses that he looks at financial markets and tries to identify booms and busts. One of the lenses that he uses is Austrian economics. He talks about Mark Thornton, the skyscraper curse. I think it's fun. It's fun because there's some good economic history. There's some good modern economic analysis. You get enough of that theoretical lens to know kind of what to look for. And so I think that's kind of an unappreciated gem within the Austrian. You can get a little bit of the Austrian sphere there. The other one that's kind of a dirty, dirty is the wrong word, a guilty pleasure of mine. I love Jim Rickard's books. There's a little, again, area of disagreement there. But his first one, Currency Wars, is a really fun book. That's kind of like there's like a third of the book is like him talking about him being brought on to the Pentagon doing a economic war game scenario and yada yada yada. And he does a really good job of kind of just picturing these smoke-filled rooms with him talking with central bankers and things like that. And I kind of like that. It makes for an entertaining read. Also there's a great history of of currency wars in the past. I think the modern environment's a little bit different, but he talks about the role of special drawing rights kind of being used as the IMF as kind of perhaps a global replacement for the dollar. I think there's some relevance there and things as we go forward. So James Rickard's Currency Wars and or Boombustology by whatever his name is, that would be my pure econ sort of aspect there. Of course, I'm intentionally leaving out all the great books available at Mises.org for free to avoid being you should read every single book that we sell. But those are just 3 non-Mises books that I would throw out there.
Wonderful. And last question: what the hell happened at the election of 1876?
Well, I think it is. One of the interesting questions is, when did America cease to be a republic and become the empire that is today? Mm-hmm. Some would argue that it was the Constitution with some degree of validity. Some would say the Civil War, which is, I think, very, very justified. One of the periods of history we don't talk enough about is post-Civil War, pre-progressive era, or World War II, really, America. And so in 1876, if you think about it, Ulysses S. Grant was in many ways kind of a bizarro George Washington figure. I don't want to try to sell the idea that George Washington, was up and beyond all vices and sins. But any financial benefits he had for being president, he was very skillful at making it appear as legitimate as possible. Ulysses S. Grant lacked that sort of tact. And so if you think about politics 1876 America, for once, 100 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and also the first time you have the World's Fair, which is kind of this great, optics of it. And here you have the most blatantly corrupt administration in early American history. And from this period, you have rise, a white knight, a man who was I think the richest man to ever run for president at the time, as a railroad attorney. The railroads, one of the reasons why this area was so rife with corruption is the railroad industry is one of the most corrupt industries in American history, given just how much it relied upon land grants and things like that. Mm-hmm. Tilden was a railroad attorney. He knew how where the bodies were buried, how the game was played, and he used that knowledge to help bring down some of those corrupt figures in American politics, such as Boss Tweed in New York. From that, he becomes governor of New York and runs for president in 1876 with the sole goal of cleaning up all the excess and corruption of the Grant administration. He wins the election. The night of the election, the New York Times writes a story, a partisan Republican at the time, New York Times writes a story casting doubt on the election results. Because of that, there's enough shenanigans, including the fact that Ulysses S. Grant has federal troops still occupying the South. You have a race to secure the ballot boxes. You have both parties in Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, and there's a dispute in Oregon. And you're filing in different ballots, claims, problems with certification, like we saw last year. And because of multiple times where Tilden could have bought the votes that he won, he refused to do so because he thought that the example mattered. And because of that, we got President Rutherford B. Hayes, governor from Ohio, who was kind of an afterthought in the political scene at that point. And so that's the moment, and because of that election, that stolen election, the Republican Party controlled the White House, the executive branch, all of the extensions of corrupt power that came there on out. In this hyper-corrupt era of railroad industries and the like, we had 24 straight years of Republican control of the executive branch. And that, to me, is the moment where the corruption, the lack of democracy, the entrenchment of that bureaucratic class, I think that's the moment where it truly became irreversible. We've seen the pattern. You had a little bit of a fight back with Cleveland, his election, which Tilden, he was a follower of Tilden. Tilden was kind of a shadow president for the first term. You get a little bit of pushback with Coolidge, whatever, but really that was kind of what broke, I think, a lot of the power there. Rothbard in the progressive era, he talks about the collapse of the third party system, which touches on some of that. Highly recommend that chapter in the progressive era. But that aspect of 1876, we literally had an American president too good to be elected because of the corruption of the times. And of course, I think the real lesson there is that when they made Hayes president, what part of the package deal was the Democrats would get Southern federal troops outside the South in Reconstruction, but the Democratic Party would also get the Grand Postmaster General position of the Hayes administration, because ultimately it turns out Tilden's Democratic Party, or at least many of the bigwigs, did not really care about ending the corruption of the Grant administration. They just simply wanted it to be their own corruption. And I think that itself is a story of the American regime ever there since.
Wow. It's a lot there. So if that one guy wasn't so, principled, he paid a little bit of money, we might have had an entire different country right now. It would have been very different.
No, sometimes you gotta know when to get your hands a little dirty. But that's a whole lot of that's a whole different aspect of what history teaches you about power.
Yeah, that's my critique to a lot of libertarians is they're very principled and they're great scholars, but when it comes to politics, they don't want to get their hands dirty, and they just a lot of things they fail to act on.
Yep.
Well, so it's been great. Go ahead and plug yourself. Where can people find you at?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at @thebishop. Rothbard.report.com. I need to publish some new articles over there. If you want to follow the politics stuff, you want to see the pure performance. Facebook, the Bay County Republican Party of Florida is where I do the pure party work, and then the Bay County Republican Roundtable is a YouTube channel where I publish our meetings there. Which I've got some stuff there I think is pretty good. So if you want to see the practice of the way I'm approaching politics here in Bay County, Florida, that's the best way to see the product of that.
Wonderful. Well, everybody, there's been another episode of the Catholic Libertarian Book Club. Go read more books and donate to the Mises Institute.
There you go.